everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm joined by writer and poet Niall O'Gallagher to talk about his book of selected poems, The Sounds of Love, or to give it its Gaelic title, Niall.
Fuaimean Gràidh.
How are you doing? Lovely to see you.
I'm good, Ali. How are you?
I'm well, I'm really well. So this is a book of Gaelic poems with translations into English. I thought maybe to begin with, you might read a little bit.
Sure. I thought I'd begin with this poem called Ual, which was my son's first word.
Wow.
So this is a poem about that. There's quite a lot of poems for the Wains Alley in this book. It's been a theme, an ongoing theme. So what I'll do is I'll read it first in Gaelic. This poem's from my second collection. And then when I've finished reading it in Gaelic, I will read it in a really lovely English translation by Deborah Moffat. Ual. Can a bhí stevi, agus said the hiadachtal, Kleinium if the changa, Enium a ves as blaste, Ual. A gali jachrain and foed ein at vielse, Apid ein uad ella, Margaret brie her sheen te van, Ual. Gav blastjes to ho messeleef, Kumug the groei rooi, agus ega, Uanje, if not jerak, Ual. Rach don chryf i'r son am fair as milse, shereb o hwcal sias, gaf dy lor, cair yn maie, agus tŵg ad vocug, yn ymbryn yn ffachlyn, sŵn y cainj, yn sŵgrig, tachnioch, sŵlfer, ual. Comolat, na tod added yn nahed awn, na aprug nach yn gŵt a hag a fair yw ffwrain, vrir yn fesen Fuaimean Gràidh, echgilus alje, Ual. Apple, translated by Deborah Moffat. Say it again, son, your first word. Let me hear it on your tongue, the name of the most delicious fruit. Apple, the two short syllables burbling like music in your mouth. Say it again, one more time, as if it were a charm, an incantation. Apple. Take a bite, a taste, you love it so, whether green or red, and the shape of it, like your flushed cheeks. Apple. Go to the tree to pick the one most sweet, most tart, have your fill, take more, immerse yourself in the pith of the words, the essence of the language, the joyful play of it. Apple. Never mind the serpent, don't let it be said that all of these aren't meant for you. This abundance of words, of fruit, the sounds of love, this most beautiful rhyme, apple.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. No, it really is. And am I right in saying that this is the first time that your poetry has been translated into English?
In a book it is.
Yeah.
So there's three books that go towards this selected poems. And those books are over a 10-year period, really, in which they're all just in Gaelic only.
Yeah.
So when we started putting this book together, the selected poems together, we already had about 20 poems, something like that, which had been translated into English for anthologies or for public readings, for those kind of occasions where you need an English translation.
Yeah.
But really from that point, the two main translators, Peter Mackay and Deborah Moffat, were commissioned to translate the rest of the poem. There's about 60 poems in the book. So there are lots of new translations as well, some translations that have been around for a while, but yeah, it is the first time that I've had a book in which I've had Gaelic on one side and English on the other.
And what's that process like for you?
It's really great. You know, I mean, it's the people I'm talking about are poets.
Yeah.
So what you're really talking about is new poetry coming out of poems which I've written. And I think my attitude to it is just to see it as a gift and to try and stand back as far as possible. I don't like to interfere or over-interfere. You probably speak to Peter and Deborah and they'll tell you the true story. But from my perspective, I don't really want to do that. I think it's just a case of admiring and enjoying what they've done. And sometimes the English translations end up being really quite different on the surface level from what I've written. But then what I like is if they're closer to the feeling of the poem or to the atmosphere of the poem or to the the music of the poem. But it's not a line by line discussion or argument or anything like that. It really is just sitting back and allowing these other poets to do their work.
And is that easy to do? Because as we've just heard, there's some very personal poetry in there. Is that something that you were concerned about, or you're in hands with those particular people?
Yeah, I think I'm okay with it, really. I mean, I think once you put something in a poem, and yeah, you're right. There's lots of personal material in the poems that I write, but I think when you put things in a poem, you're allowing it to be shared. And I don't just mean by the fact of reading it on a podcast or publishing it in a book, but just putting things in a poem. And I think particularly for me, putting things into meter and rhyme means that you're putting things in a special kind of a form, a special kind of a structure, which the purpose of which is to allow it to be shared by other people. So really, by the time you've written your poem, that process has already happened. You've already taken that personal material and made something from it. So for it to then go on to be translated into another language is great. But I don't have that kind of trauma of letting go of the poem, because in a certain sense, you've already done that.
Yeah. Like all art, you're part of the process is offering it out for other people's interpretation.
Yeah, because a translator is a reader first and foremost. And the thing with the translators, you get to see what they're reading. Well, the vast majority of readers, you don't get to see how they've read it. So yeah, there is that.
And was there ever a chance that you were going to translate them?
No, there never was in my case. We've had a bit of a row about this, Ali, in Gaelic poetry over the past kind of 30, 40 years. And I've always, from the beginning of starting to write poetry, I always made a very kind of clear decision, and that despite what others do, that I wasn't going to do that.
Right.
In a way, really, the reasons for making that decision, which were quite a long time ago now, are less and less relevant to me, because once you have a starting point, you just go ahead from it, and things emerge. And now that the poems have been translated, by Peter, Deborah, by others as well, and not just into English but into other languages, well, it's worked out really well for me, and it's worked out really well for the poems. So I'm glad I did it. The reasons for the row are partly political. They're partly really to do with the idea about the kind of anxiety that Gaelic poets have had about really contributing to the poem's obsolescence, if I can put it like that. And just to simply say that if you rewrite a poem of your own in English, well, are people going to bother to read it in Gaelic?
That's interesting.
And that, of course, is tied up with the kind of ongoing anxiety we might have about the position of the language more widely.
Yeah, sure.
But there's been lots of different responses to that, and people who are good friends of mine have taken a different approach, and do rework their own poems in English or compose poems simultaneously in Gaelic and English. And I'm not the language cops. I'm not interested in telling other folk what to do. But for me, it was always quite a freeing decision just to say, no, I'm going to write these poems in Gaelic. It meant that I had to wait for this book quite a long time. And so this is 10 years since my first collection came out. And it's been 10 years since publishing a book of poems in Gaelic to publishing a book in which there's English translation. So for me, there's been a whole decade of a gap, which is longer than most published poets in Gaelic these days. But it's been great, so I'm quite happy to have got what I've got now.
And over those 10 years, how have you seen Gaelic poetry and writing change, or what have you noticed? Has there been a change? Is it more widely accepted?
I think just over time that the people change, and there's kind of over time there's kind of a generational shift just in terms of who's doing the writing and so on. And I think I think that we need to do, particularly in Gaelic poetry, we should be making sure we read our immediate predecessors and people before that as well, because there's always this danger that we kind of have this generational amnesia where we forget everything and we think we're starting from scratch. I don't think that's a good idea. But at the same time, some of the things have moved on, since, the last time there was an anthology of Gaelic poetry encompassing kind of one generation, was a book called Anain Shiriach, In the Face of Eternity, which came out in the early 1990s. And a lot has changed since then. I think one of the things that's changed is that Gaelic poetry went through this whole period in the 1960s, 70s thereafter, where there was this move towards free verse.
Right.
And that happened because of Derek Thompson. Derek Thompson was really the great influential Gaelic poet of the post-war period, in my view. And he really, despite being, or perhaps because he was like such a great scholar of the Gaelic tradition going back to the Middle Ages, he wanted to write innovative, modern poetry in free verse. And so for a whole number of decades, that really was the kind of dominant form of poetry in Gaelic, and it's still an important part of poetry in Gaelic. But I think now we're seeing that some of the reasons that happened are just less relevant now. And so there's a lot more, I think, formal variety in contemporary Gaelic poetry than there may have been at one point in the recent past, where you have lots of strict meter writing, you have experiments with different kinds of poetry. In my own case, I mean, I'm quite a far out extreme case. All my poems rhyme and are in very strict syllable counting meter, and I'm probably, in a bit of a space of my own in that respect. But nonetheless, I do think there has been a change towards just a kind of a wider range of forms within Gaelic poetry.
I was going to ask you, do you see yourself as belonging to more than one tradition? Maybe there's a Gaelic tradition, but there's other, perhaps European traditions, other types of poetry that influence your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have quite what you might call a pan-Gaelic perspective on the tradition, which is that I've always read a lot of poetry in Irish. And not just I mean, if you go back a couple of hundred years in Gaelic poetry, you're really talking about one literary language which is used in Scotland and Ireland. If you go back to, really before the 18th century. So of course there's that poetry which belongs to everybody, but then I've always read a lot of modern Irish poetry. Poetry by people like Nolan O'Gallagher, Micheál Hartnett, Betty Jenkinson, poets like this from the kind of, from some of whom are still writing, others who aren't with us anymore, but really from relatively recent, just a generation above me, and they've had a big influence on my writing. And then there is that thing, that influence of the earlier Gaelic and Irish poetry, early modern and late medieval poetry, which I found myself going back to after my first book, because I was really looking, Ali, for a kind of standard form I could write in that wasn't other than free verse. I felt like I was reinventing the wheel every time I wrote a poem, because I had to decide from scratch what was going to be. Was it going to be a sonnet? Was it going to be, something else? And I found in this, in the poetry of the old poetry schools, the old kind of formal poetry schools of Ireland and Gaelic Scotland, these meters, which are very, very strict, but also very sensual and very supple. And a lot of what I've been really doing over the past 10 years has been trying to write a kind of a modern poetry using these kind of techniques.
And to go back to your collection, the title in English, The Sounds of Love, is an interesting title. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it came from that poem, the poem I read, Ual, or Apple. It's the last line in the poem. And so Sounds of Love refers to, as incidentally, I really wanted the title of this book really to be influenced by one of the English translations, to be a kind of a phrase that arose from something that Deborah or Peter had done, in this case Deborah. So Sounds of Love is the sound of language, in the sense that poem's about my son's first words. So it's, the sounds of love are all the sounds of language. So there's that. But there's also lots of music in the book. I've got a sequence of poems called Poems to a Harp. And I came across in the Scottish Poetry Library one day a really old poem called Dan the Chlarcy, a poem to a harp. And the poet, back in I think the 14th century, was writing this praise poem, but addressed not to one of the aristocrats, but rather addressed to this musical instrument. He would go through and he would praise in turn all the different elements of the instrument. Now, like you with your guitar and your wall, I'm a musician as well, and so music is a big part of my way of thinking about the arts and thinking about poetry is in musical terms. So there's lots of poems about harps. There's a poem in the voice of the pianist at Glasgow Central train station. So it kind of fitted in naturally. And also there's just lots of love poems. That's the other side of it. There's lots of different kinds of love poems in this book. And one of the nice things about doing a selected poems is you get to kind of go back and look at what you've done.
Sure.
Because I think when you're doing things, you're just doing them. I suppose other people maybe are different, but I think you go on and you do it. But when you're having to do a kind of a retrospective, and you kind of see the recurring obsessions that you have over this, longer period of time. There's probably about 15 years of poetry in this book, and lots of love poems in there, yeah.
And when you go back to ones that you've written as much as 10 years ago or more, are they different to you? Do they offer up different things to you after that time?
It definitely feels like someone else wrote them,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's taking it too far. But there's some poems in early poems in the book where I read them and I'm reminded of who I was at that point in my life, I think some poets like to revise their early poetry, and I couldn't bear to do that. I think, naturally you should get better. You should get at least technically better as you go on. You should develop your craft. But I couldn't bear the idea of going back and trying to tinker with and improve any of my older poems. I think they are what they are. And I'm happy just for them to be poems written by a younger guy who was just getting started. That's fine,
Yeah, I mean, similarly to bands or musicians, who their early work is very much defining of that time when they were doing these things.
Yeah, and similar to bands and musicians, I prefer my difficult second album, Yeah, because people like the first collection because it was a lot of love poems set in Glasgow, and before I ended up getting really, really involved in dictionaries and early modern metrical systems. But there you go. You have to.
Your jazz odyssey.
That's right. That's right.
And there are different strands to the book. You've mentioned the music of the harp, and there's also visions of the city of Glasgow. And why include those poems? Is this about your relationship with the city?
It partly is. I mean, the Glasgow poems go back to my first book, which had a picture of the Glasgow subway as the motif on the front cover. So I've always written about Glasgow. I mean, I've started writing poetry at a time when I was living in Glasgow, and that's always been there. Then later on, I ended up getting this appointment as the Gaelic Poet Laureate for the city of Glasgow, and at that point, I had to kind of look again at how am I going to address poetry of the city. And that involved a commission to write 3 poems, but then that grew into a sonnet sequence of 12 poems, which is the one sequence from the previous books, which is reproduced in whole in this selected poems. The poems are called Ceann Siarna or Kentigern. And there were a lot of things going on there. Part of it was, and I've said this before, but I work as a journalist, and I didn't want to write a kind of a journalistic poetry. I didn't want to write a kind of a reportage in verse. So I found myself going back to the stories about Enoch and Mungo and so on, and finding in that kind of mythology a way I could write poetry. But there's also other strands of it too. There's a strand which is to do with mixing fantastical things and more everyday things. I mean, like all the Alistair Gray books over my shoulder, there's definitely an element of that. And there's an element too of following the example of people like Edmund Morgan and Robert Garriott, who used the sonnet sequence about the city. As I think Garriott's the first to do that with his Edinburgh sonnets, and then Morgan follows after that with his sonnets with his Glasgow sonnets before he goes on to write the kind of national sonnet sequence. So all these various strands come in. And I really like writing sonnets, Ali. I think I'm going to write more and more of them. And there's the sonnets in my first book, and there's the big group of sonnets in the last book, which is reproduced here. And I love the sonnet form. I just love it. I just think it has just an infinite number of possibilities. But I also think that for a poet in Scotland, and maybe particularly for a poet writing in Gaelic in Scotland, I mean, the sonnet is an international form. If we're going to be specific about it, you might say it's a Sicilian form, right? But we don't really think of it as that anymore. We think of it as being one of the forms of poetry that really goes all over Europe and beyond as well. And so it's quite exciting when you're writing sonnets in Gaelic to be thinking about Petrarch and Rilke and, and to be part of that wider scheme.
I think that's what I meant when I said about writing in a tradition. And, it's a huge tradition, but also kind of one which is global, as you say.
Yeah, and there's also just the thing of like trying to make, I mean, one of the things I think your job is as a poet is to make the language sound unlike it sounded before. And I think sometimes that's the exact reverse of what people expect poets to do. If we want poetry to sound comforting or to sound traditional or to sound like things we already know, okay, fair enough. But I actually think that one of the jobs of a poet is to take the language and to create a music which has not been heard before in it. And so I think if you're writing, one of the ways to help you do that is to write in a form which is very strict, which is also, the echoes in that form are the echoes of Petrarch and 1,000 other poets going back to the Italian Renaissance. And that's great for Gaelic because it pushes you.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to a poet in Ireland, Simon O'Phelan, who's also recently written a sonnet sequence. And so we're talking about the idea that there is what the Gaelic sonnet and what is the Gaelic sonnet about? But one of the things the Gaelic sonnet is about taking the language, putting it on this international stage and seeing how it sits alongside all those other languages. And it's really important to say, not just Shakespeare,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a problem with Shakespeare, but it's really important in the Gaelic context that the English language poetry culture isn't our only frame of reference.
Yeah. Would you mind reading another one of your poems?
Will I read it? Will I read one of the sonnets for fun?
I think that would be perfect.
Let's do that. Yeah. So I'll read the Glasgow Central poem. So this is a poem in the voice. I like writing poems in other voices and not just in my own voice. I mean, I do write plenty of autobiographical stuff, but that's only because I know the material well,
Yeah.
But sometimes I like to write poems in other voices. This poem is in the voice of the guy sitting down playing the piano at Glasgow Central Station. And it occurred to me that here was this piano. And I think of Glasgow Central as the centre of the city, the heart of the city. Mm-hmm. But really also for me, Glasgow Central Station, in my imagination, is kind of the centre point of Scotland itself,
Right.
And there's this musical instrument sitting there at the very heart of the country, and people are rushing on past it, without really considering that it's there until someone sits down to play it. Mm-hmm. And then this happens. So, Fuaimean ag Glasgow. Nu de hanig ni, vain a haf. Vrisht mi in saucher balav lishe hjol. Clishk na va dol shachet. Clishaw, arsiet. Gar borig, le glaurig arsht. Len mi orm gebolog, ach jas na van lahet. Is rein in glors en kadam foim of a homoor. Snach kleintje gros na trein de glaar. Hochlichige ach misje. Bernadig en fakig en host. Hommel en kudde, jo boelig bosch. A fianna chuiv, ha vistje u benti malaven sit a rui. Par gach juchroch gil, gach juchroch dui. The Pianist at Glasgow Central, translated this time by Jim Carruth.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. When I sat down to give you back your voice, it was to break the silence of your muse. The first passers-by complained, "Who are you to deafen us with this ungainly noise?" I ignored those petty jibes behind my back, for others came thirsty as for rain after drought, a growing crowd whose clapping and shouts drowned out the daily grunt of trains on tracks. Who would play on this day if not for me? A shame on all those who've kept you mute. No strict censure would make me follow suit. Listen, piano, to all that you can be, as with the freeing touch of human hand, every key is released to make it stand.
That's brilliant. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank
And
you.
I was thinking, as you mentioned, Alistair Gray, and the books over the shoulder. And have you got other influences on your poetry who aren't poets themselves?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. Yeah, composers.
Right.
So Bela Bartok, for example, Hungarian composer in the first half of the 20th century. And one of the things Bartok did was he went all around Central Europe collecting traditional melodies. And he did something really unusual, or maybe for the first time in Western music, instead of writing orchestral music in which these tunes would appear, he actually analysed and studied the way the tunes were formed. And then he, having done that, wrote new music based on some of those patterns and some of those harmonies, which were really just really different. If you think about where Hungary being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and therefore being part of, to a certain extent, that kind of Central European classical music culture, which was a German language culture, the culture of Mozart and Beethoven. And what Bartok did was that he took all this wider, very unusual sounding music in the context of Mozart and Beethoven, and he brought it in to the Western classical tradition in this very, very revolutionary way. I mean, Bartok was a genius, but I do that as an idea has always been something I've been very interested in. So in writing my poetry, I've spent lots of time, Ali, over the years reading older Gaelic and Irish poetry and really trying to understand how it's made,
right,
at a technical level, and then trying to. I mean, what you discover, of course, when you do that is that there is no, if I can put it this way, native tradition which is separate from the European tradition, because the interplay between the two it has been going on for as long as Gaelic-speaking people learned to use the Roman alphabet to write.
Yeah.
So it's not that the two things are entirely separate, but what you find is there's this constant relationship between the two, between the literature of mainland Europe and the literature of Ireland and Gaelic Scotland. And I feel like I'm just trying to continue on in that style, but in the context of writing poetry in the 21st century, by trying to take, by really studying how this poetry works, and then trying to bring it together with the European poetry I love and trying to write something new. And I think I've never had the chance to say that before. I'm really glad that you asked me that question. But really, Bela Bartok is a massive influence on just the whole way I think about what we're doing.
I was going to say if that was a good question, that's a great answer.
Yeah. I mean, I think of poetry as basically as music for the spoken voice. And so very often my questions to myself are technical, structural, formal questions, as much as they are political or ethical or anything else. That they start off as being really questions about what happens if I put these two things together. How can I create a poetry which does both this and that, which has an echo of this and an echo of that? And quite often that's the catalyst. That's what gets me writing.
And there's a wonderful introduction by Alan Titley to the book, and he has a description of you as, I'm quoting, one of those poets who lives the new while singing the old. Is that a description you recognise? It's a fantastic description, I have to say.
It's a very generous description. I'm very, very grateful to Alan Titley for being so generous. I mean, Alan is really a massive figure in Irish language writing of the last number of decades, and he was very, very generous in writing that introduction for me. But I also do feel like he got what I was trying to do, whether I got there or not is a different question. But Alan certainly understands what I was trying to do, which is to say that the older Gaelic and Irish tradition didn't stop; it was interrupted. Yeah. and there's plenty there still for us to build upon. Plenty of unexplored areas there. So absolutely. I mean, I think as well, I think, and I've talked a wee bit about this earlier, about the move to free verse in Gaelic poetry, and I think it was Donald Macaulay who said that he wanted to write without the ghosts of the Gaelic song tradition being audible in every line. And without any disrespect to Donald Macaulay, I don't think that's possible.
Right.
I think that's what language is. You know, language will always carry the ghosts of those who have used it previously and those who have written it previously. So if you take my view that that isn't possible, then you may as well try and have some kind of fun with those echoes and try and enjoy those echoes and try and perhaps exploit some of those echoes. And I definitely see, you know, in terms of Alan's, you know, generosity, I definitely see myself as writing in the same literary tradition as the older Gaelic and Irish poets. So, you know, I think I'm writing in that tradition. And by older, I mean going back into the first millennium AD. But obviously with everything that comes with being a 21st century guy as well, you know.
Yeah. It is a great introduction because it sets you up for your poetry coming next in a way that few others often do that. You know, they might praise the poet or whatever, but this one I think really gets into what you're trying to do, as you say, and sets the reader up for what's coming next.
We were going to put it at the end of the book.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, you know, when as a reader, I mean, we're just readers first and foremost, aren't we? You know, I think sometimes as a reader, I'm a little bit wary of introductions because they kind of preempt my reaction. But Alan's introduction when we got it, Clive Bootle, the publisher, and I got it back, was just so helpful and insightful, and just got it, you know. And that we felt, no, this deserves to go at the front of the book. We'll keep it there.
So now that this collection is out there, you've said it's been quite a long time coming. Can you say what's next for you? Are you just continually writing?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on a book for the past couple of years, which is called Leitrig and Playa, or Plague Letters, and it is what you think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember at the time of the pandemic, if I can put it in the past tense, I'm not sure that I can, but at the height of the pandemic, we kept getting asked for poems, you know, and I really wasn't ready to tell anyone what I thought about it in verse, and that was partly because as a journalist, I was working on nothing else for that whole period, you know. But I did want to write about what happened to us. And I mean, I think that there's a desire to move on from that experience, which is entirely understandable, but I'm not sure is entirely wise either.
Yeah.
And actually, we do need to acknowledge what happened, not just to the people that lost their lives, but what happened in our own lives. And so there's this book is a series of letters in verse between various characters. It's a book of fiction. It's a book of it's a verse novella, I think. And they're describing their experience in a situation not unlike the one that we all went through, at least here. And of course, what was great is that they all react differently to it. You know, I mean, I think that one of the things that the kind of COVID brought up for me was that we wanted to have this sense of solidarity and this sense of shared experience. But I'm afraid I don't think that there was a shared experience. I think our experience, as with everything else, depended on whether we were rich or poor, or young or old, and 101 other factors, you know. And so inevitably, the experience is very different. So we get some characters for whom this is a disaster, and we get other characters. One character in particular who, the moment that the lockdown, although it's not called that in the book, but the moment when the lockdown happens, goes home, closes the door, locks it, and bursts into tears of joy. Because for some people, that that meant a freedom from other obligations, you know.
Absolutely.
So I've been writing a lot about that, and I hope I'm going to finish that book soon, so that we can publish it, and then I'll have done the thing, and
you have moved on from. I think it's a really interesting idea, because I think you're right. People almost want to put it behind them without reflecting on what happened. And I think in the long term, that's probably not a healthy thing.
But we know that trauma that isn't addressed comes back, you know.
Mm.
I mean, I think we know that. But so it's taken me a while to do it, you know. But I think I've done it now, and that's, and also a new departure for me because it's writing fiction, you know.
Yeah.
And it's moving from, you know, writing persona poems, writing poems and voices, to the kind of almost the next logical step, which is to say, okay, well, let's just make a story with 4 different voices and see how they all relate to one another. But me being me, it's in a very strict
Yeah.
metrical form, and there are exactly 9 syllables in every line. Although inevitably, I mean, I remember when my first book was published, I had a sequence where every poem had 12 lines of 11 syllables each. And one of those poems, Ali, has 1 line in which there are 12. And when I discovered this is after it went into print, oh my goodness, it was a dark day. So inevitably, now that this poem or this book is over 1,000 lines long, you know, there's bound to be one line in there which is 10 syllables.
I can tell you're already worried about that.
Yeah, I'm quite concerned about this, but you know, I think you have to accept that, you know, it's not that there's, you know, there's going to be typos in a book, and the question is just where are they going to appear? Because you can't fully control these things, you know.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that. That sounds fantastic. Niall, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's really good to catch up.
You too. Great pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.